Hey everyone, this is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to part 9 of my Logic Pro 10 201 course. In this tutorial, I'll show you drum sampling and beat building with Drum Machine Designer. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, Drum Machine Designer really just handles the routing of the samples. Under the hood, UltraBeat is still actually doing all the heavy lifting. However, the interface of Drum Machine Designer is a bit simpler to work with, and there's also some cool macro controls down here to work with without having to get too deep into UltraBeat's synthesis controls. So this is just the kit that I loaded up before in the beginning to create just a simple beat to follow along with. So I'm going to double click down here and create a new software instrument track. And you'll notice that when you load Drum Machine Designer as a software instrument, it actually shows up down here rather than the rest of the software instruments. And no matter what you do, it'll always load up a preset. It loads up this big room preset. So you can actually start from scratch in two different ways. One, you can right click up here and choose clear all cells. This will clear all of the instruments, all of the samples in that preset. However, the routing and smart controls are all going to be the same for that preset. So you can kind of use that as a tool if you want. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to start from scratch. So the way you can start from scratch is go to the library, go to Drum Machine Designer, and go to Empty Kit. And this will give you a completely empty kit to start with. And from here, you can drag and drop your own samples into the kit and build your own custom kit. One thing to note, though, is that you don't have to choose an empty kit to drag and drop samples in. You can still do this with any of the presets. So if you really like one of the presets, but you just don't like the snare drum, you can just drag and drop your own custom snare drum in. Okay, so another thing I want you to notice is that the notes on these cells are not in chromatic order. So here's C1, which is typically the kick drum, D1, which is typically the snare, and then C#1 is after that. But if these were in chromatic order, it would be C1, D#, or C#1, then D1. So it groups these cells by like instrument. For example, F#, G#, and A# are all here, and those are typically used for hi-hats. F, G, and A are all here, and those are typically used for toms. So I've got my drum samples here. These are the same samples from the previous video, so I'll leave a link to that in the video description below where you can download these for free. And I'm just going to drag and drop my samples into the kit, and I'm going to try to follow the GM drum kit order again. So my tight kick 1 is going to go on C1. My snare is going to go on D1, tight snare on D1. And my C#1 or D#1 could be my clap sound. So let's put the clap on D#1. And I've got 3 hi-hats. I'm going to put those on F#, G#, and A#. So let's drag those in. And then I've got 2 crashes. I'll put those on C#2 and D#2. Those are typically used for crashes and cymbals. But now I'm left with a couple extra samples. I've got tight kick 2, which was a softer tight kick. I have the sub kick, which is a low boomy kick. And then I have my snare impact, which was like an explosive snare drum. I could just throw these on the extra samples that are here, but I want to put them on notes that I would normally use. So typically I would actually use B0 for either the sub kick or for the secondary kick, but there is no B0 here, and we can't go any lower than C1. Because again, keep in mind that Drum Machine Designer works on top of UltraBeat, and UltraBeat can only go down to C1. It doesn't go down any further than that. So I'm going to be looking for 3 cells to put these on. B1 for the sub kick, C2 for the tight kick, and then E1 for the impact snare. So if I click here, I can go to another panel or another page. Here's E1, so I'll just click and drag. And it's kind of like moving apps on an iPhone. I'll put E1 there, and then I'll map my impact snare there. And then let's go back and look for B1 and C2. Here's B1, so drag that over. Pull that right there. And here's C2, an octave higher than my original kick drum. So an octave higher, I will put my second kick, and then on B1, I'll put my sub kick. So now I have all 11 samples mapped into Drum Machine Designer. So now you can click on each sample to audition it. One thing you'll notice is that the volume is really loud and the channel is clipping for probably most of these samples. Part of this has to do with the macro controls and the macro effects that are assigned. We'll get into these in just a moment, but for now, what I'm going to do is go through each sample and pull down the volume level so that it doesn't clip. All right, so I've trimmed all the volumes for all of the samples, and here's what the whole kit sounds like. Notice that it's automatically made all of the samples one-shots, so you don't have to go into each of these samples envelope and pull out the release time like we had to do in the previous video. And also note that the levels for all of the macro controls change from sample to sample. You can also right-click on each of the icons and choose a custom icon. Now, I'm not exactly sure where the icons are for the presets, but if you right-click, it pulls up the same set of icons that you can choose for your track headers, and none of them look like any of the icons that are in any of the Drum Machine Designer presets, but you can load in a custom preset if you like. And you know what, while I'm at it, while I'm still here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to reorder these in a more logical way. So now I have kicks, snares, hats, and crashes organized in a way that actually makes sense. And this just changes where they are visually. It doesn't actually change the pitch that we map them to. So when you click on each of your samples, you'll notice that there's 6 parameters here and 6 parameters here. These 6 macro controls control various synthesis elements within Ultrabeat. So you can control the pitch, fine pitch, so pitch is like semitones, half steps. You can option click on these to reset them. Pitch is in cents. And then you have attack time. So as you pull this up, this actually softens the attack. Decay time, which shortens the decay time. Volume, which we used before, and pan. So let's play around with this a bit. Let me use the sub kick, for example, here. So one thing I may do later is I may create a few different sub kicks on different pitches and make them follow the bass line of the song. So that's one thing you can do. You can create different ones and tune them differently. With the impact snare, one thing you may consider doing is shortening the decay time. Just to make it a shorter, tighter snare. So it's still got that nice, big, full, explosive tone, but it's not as long as it was before. So that's another thing you can do. For the cymbals, I'm typically going to crash them both at the same time. So to get a bit of a stereo effect, you can pan these left and right. And then together, you get a nice stereo effect. These 6 macro controls are controlled by effects that are on the individual Ultrabeat multi-output channels. Now, by default, the high cut and low cut filters are turned on. And notice that when I select a sample here, when I select a cell, rather, that when you turn these on and off, this turns on and off various plugins on the selected cell's Ultrabeat channel. So let me go ahead and turn these 4 off again. The first 2 are high cut and low cut filter, and these are controlled within the channel EQ. And if I pull down the high cut filter, notice that it controls the low pass filter. If I pull up the low cut filter, it controls the high pass filter. For my cymbals, I'm definitely going to want to cut out some of the low end to get rid of some of that low end rumble. So going back to the clap sample here, let's use the spread, reverb, and drive options to customize the sound a bit. So if I turn on the spread macro control, this turns on the sample delay plugin. And if I pull up the spread amount, what this does is it delays the left channel from the right channel and creates a nice stereo spread effect. With the reverb macro, this turns on the silver verb, and pulling up the reverb pulls down the dry, but pulls up the wet amount. And then with the drive knob, this turns on the overdrive plugin, And when we pull up the drive, this pulls up the drive amount and also pulls down the output volume to compensate. And then the crush is a bit crusher. This turns on the bit crusher plugin. And when you roll this up, you can see it pulls the resolution down. So I'm going to use the drive knob, but not the bit crusher. So now our clap is a bit more pronounced. I'll add a bit of drive to the snare tight sample as well, just to saturate it a bit. Now, in addition to the macro or smart controls down here for each individual cell, if you click on the kit up here, the actual name of the kit up here, you'll see some additional effects that are global for the entire kit. And you'll see these are effects that are directly on the channel strip for that kit. And then I just realized I haven't even given this kit a name, so I'll just call this custom kit. There we go. And each of these smart controls or macro controls, whatever you want to call them, control different plugins on the channel strip for the kit. So this affects everything in the kit. So you've got drive, which turns on the overdrive plugin. You've got another bit crusher. You've got a compressor, which turns on the compressor plugin, which I will use a bit of that. When you pull up the compressor amount, this pulls down the threshold and pulls up the ratio to give you a little more punch. And then there's also a transient macro control here. This pulls up the enveloper plugin. And in the enveloper plugin, this just pulls up the gain and the time of the attack to give the front end attack of each note you play a bit more punch. So I'm going to use a touch of that as well. The phaser and flanger effects are actually both contained within the pedal board plugin. So I'll play around with these a bit. Not exactly something I want to use for this drum kit, but they're there if you need them. And then the delay just pulls up the stereo delay, and the reverb turns on the platinum verb. I don't want any more reverb or really any delay on these drums at all. I may put a little delay on the hi-hats. Sometimes I do that just to give it a little bit of an ambient effect, but I don't want reverb and delay on the kit as a whole, so I'm going to go ahead and turn those off. Now, one thing to note here, I'm going to click on my snare impact, is that the volume control macro actually controls the channel of each of the samples. I'm in pre-fader metering right now, and you'll see that the channels still clip even if the main channel doesn't clip. So if I click on my snare impact, that channel is actually clipping by 14.3 dB. The main channel is clipping by 1.1 dB. So you might think, oh, just pull this down a couple dB and that'll get rid of the problem. The problem is that the main channel is still clipping pre-fader. So what I actually prefer to do with real loud samples like this is I prefer to actually go back into Ultrabeat and adjust their channels there so they don't clip, and then go back and rebalance the volume levels of the whole kit. It's not 100% necessary, but it sort of caters to my OCD and about channels clipping and things like that. So if you open the mixer, you'll see that this drum kit is right here. This is the enclosing folder for it all. If you open that up, the very first channel is Ultrabeat, and the rest of the channels are all Ultrabeat multi-outputs, or subgroups as we saw they were called in the previous video. So if I open up Ultrabeat, you'll see all of those instruments that we just loaded in Drum Machine Designer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset the volume of all of these channels, and then I'm going to pull each of them down here so that the output level coming out of Ultrabeat is lower. And I'm going to try to give each one around 6 to 9 dB of headroom for all of them to sort of work together as a unit. Okay, so off screen I adjusted all of the levels of the samples in Ultrabeat, but if I play back multiple samples together, you'll see that the main channel still clips even though the individual channels aren't clipping, which is also causing the master fader to clip. So because we adjusted the pre-fader level, so we're not clipping, we can actually go in now and adjust the actual fader level of each of these instruments a bit and duck that down so that when all of these are played at the same time, it doesn't make the overall kit clip. So we're still getting pretty close to clipping, but I think that's okay for now. If we need to, we can go back in and mixing and we can pull down these individual channels. So I think I'm all set with my custom drum kit now. Next, I'm just going to go through and create some different beats and patterns for each section of my song. And I am heavily going to use some of the pre-existing patterns I've already created, but I'm going to elaborate on those with my new samples. Okay, so off screen, I built a few patterns here. And I'm going to show you a couple things that I did to sort of prep for this. One, I pulled down all the levels of all the drums, even a bit more, because they were still clipping the main channel here. Another thing I did is in the drum machine, not in the drum machine designer, in Ultrabeat, what I did was I went in and I made a single trigger hi-hat group out of the 3 hi-hats, kind of like I showed you in the previous video, because I've got some spots where the open hi-hat plays and I want it to be choked by either of the 2 closed hats. So that's one thing I did there. So let's start with this first pattern. This is in the intro as well as in the chorus. Once you start using all of your patterns, or all of your cells, that is, or all your samples, what you can do is you can click here and this will reduce down your pattern just to the notes that you're using in that region. So that's kind of helpful. But it's not very helpful if you haven't created something yet. So I'll start in piano roll and then I'll reduce it down later once I've used all the instruments that I want for this pattern, and then add in the notes as I see fit. So here's the very first pattern. So what I did was I added in the crashes, I added in the sub kick just at the front end of the beat. I took the whole hi-hat pattern. It's almost identical to the original hi-hat pattern we created with the brush tool early on, but what I've done is I've sort of not arpeggiated, but I've broken up the 3 hi-hats so it doesn't get so samey. So I'm sort of bouncing back between the first and second hi-hat, and then occasionally using the open hi-hat. And then I've added in a few extra kicks here with the second tight kick. Because remember, that second tight kick was a little softer. It didn't have as much front end as the main tight kick. So I'm using it for sort of like offbeat accents. And then I've layered up the snare drum and the impact snare together. And I'm just accenting with claps here and there. And the sound I'm kind of going for with this, just to let you know up front, is if you haven't heard of them, there's a group called Dance with the Dead, and they do sort of like a retro synthwave sort of sound. It's got like an 80s feel, but like a modern vibe to it. It's really heavy and really forward, and I'm kind of going for that sort of sound, but infusing sort of like a trap style beat, like a trap style hi-hat at least. And maybe a little more accessible, maybe a little more poppy. We have a singer coming in to sing this too. So, but that's kind of the sound I'm going for. So, I mean, if you want like a good reference for the sound I'm ultimately going to be going for, go check out the Near Dark album from Dance with the Dead. It's great stuff. I think it's pretty much all instrumental stuff too. So, okay, so that's just the first pattern. The second pattern is during the first verse, and I'm going to start the playhead here just a little bit before the first verse, because I want to talk about something about this transition here.
Tell me that you see it, can you feel it, can you hear it call your name? It's a broken world alone. We got kids with no shelter, lies from our leaders, pain from the sky to the sea, death with no freedom, hearts with no heroes, baby, it's just you and me. Please tell me.
So the transition going from the intro into the first verse, we're going to add a bit of like a filter sweep down into this, so it's not going to seem so abrupt going from this heavy beat into this soft, really basic 4 on the floor sort of pattern there. There's also sort of like the stereotypical like clap buildup. I may do more with this and make more out of it later, but for now, this is what I've done with it. I've just basically taken the velocities and faded them in. So if you don't know how to do a velocity fade, there's a couple different ways to do it. Let me just reset all of these. So right now, all these claps are at the same velocity. One way to do it is you can actually do it down in the what used to be called not the hyper editor but hyper draw. Now it's just your MIDI automation or your region automation. The problem is if I use the line tool to draw in velocity automation down here, it's going to affect all of the notes. I just want to affect the claps. I don't want to affect everything else. So what you can do is you can use a transform window function. So if you go up to functions, MIDI transform, go to crescendo. A crescendo is just a term to mean to, sort of fade in or increase in volume. And what you do is you set the position of the fade. So basically the starting point is 26 and the ending point is 34 while you have those notes selected. So only select the notes that you want this to be applied to. So you just double click here, type in 26, hit enter, click here, type in 34, hit enter. So this will set the position or the range of the crescendo. And then what you do is down here under the velocity column here, you choose your starting velocity and ending velocity. So I chose 20 and 127, which is max velocity. And then you just hit operate only, and it'll operate that MIDI transformation just to those notes.
Kids with no shelter, lies from our leaders, pain from the sky to the sea. Death with no freedom, hearts with no heroes, baby, it's just you and me. Please sit.
And then that takes us right into the chorus. And I'll probably do something different with this fill here. I'm not exactly sure. What I end up doing with transitions ends up affecting the way I draw out my fills. So I may do something different there. We'll just figure that out when I get to that point. So then it takes us back into the chorus, which is the same beat as the beginning.
Please tell me how, when all
And then I've got my pattern for the second verse here. It's just a real basic 4 on the floor pattern with some accented hi-hats and kicks on some 16th notes.
It's just a tragedy. You got it all, but you can't break free. You're losing time when you're wasting lives. The commas on the line. We got kids with no future, lies from our leaders, pain from the sky to the sea. A world torn asunder with hate for our brothers. Baby, it's just you and me. Please tell me how, when all the world is lost.
And then that'll take us back into the chorus again. So that's beat building with the drum machine designer in Logic, as well as using the sort of underlying synthesizer underneath it, Ultra Beat. You can do this either way. You can do it with just Ultra Beat, like I showed you in the last video, or you can do it with the macro controls and drum machine designer as well, like I did in this video. And that's pretty much the beat for the song. I'm going to probably go through and tweak some of the fills, especially when we get into doing some of the transitions between the sections and fleshing out the song a bit more. A lot of the synthesizers I layer on top of this are going to determine what I actually do with the fills and the transitions and whatnot. So it's not set in stone by any means. So in the next 3 videos, this is where I'm going to be making probably the most progress in terms of building out the song and arranging the song. So in the next 3 videos, I'm going to be fleshing out the song with synthesizers, adding bass, multiple different synths, including the ES2, Alchemy, probably retro synth as well, and really fleshing out and building out the arrangement and make this arrangement finally start to come together so that we have something that's almost a finished arrangement for the vocalist to come in and sing on. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to see more content like this. Check out my social media on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Patreon. Thanks for the support, and thanks for watching.